Yo guys, racing F122 with a controller can be a little tricky at first. The cars in F122 are incredibly fast and can corner with a lot of speed. This makes controlling them at high speed with just a small joystick a bit of a challenge, and that's not even to mention trying to accelerate without spinning our wheels. It's safe to say that controller racers may be at a little bit of a disadvantage compared to those racing with a physical wheel. But that isn't to say this has to be the case. There are plenty of F122 racers who are incredibly fast and consistent using a controller, and with just a few small settings changes, you can really increase the amount of precision and control you have over cars in F122. The calibration menu is one of the first places you should start when setting up your controller in F122. Here you can test that all of the functions and inputs are working correctly, and we can also start to change our settings to increase our precision with the controller. The absolute first thing you'll want to do is quickly check that your controller is working correctly. Do this by starting the button test within the calibration menu. You'll see this icon in the bottom right corner. Simply press the correct button and start the test. You can now start to move your analog stick from side to side to check that your steering inputs are being recognised. You should see the bar on the right hand side moving from -100 throughout to 100. If you can hit both -100 and 100, this means your controller is reading the full range of your analog stick. If you can't quite reach 100 on either side, don't worry, as I'll look at how we can fix that in just a minute. Repeat this step with both triggers to ensure your brake and throttle inputs are being correctly read as well. Again, you should be able to reach 100 when pressing either trigger fully. With that done, close the button test as we can now start to adjust some controller settings. You'll see on the left side of the screen, we have dead zone, linearity and saturation setting for all three inputs we just tested. Your dead zone is an indication of how much you need to move or press an input before it is registered. Essentially, increasing this setting for either the steering, throttle or braking will increase the dead zone at the start of the input. For example, if you increase the steering dead zone, you'll be able to slightly move your analog stick without any steering input being registered. This is handy if your car feels twitchy or if the steering is moving when driving in a straight line. Your linearity changes the linearity curve of your input. This will change the sensitivity of your inputs towards the start of their motion. Adjusting your linearity will make your initial steering inputs feel much less sensitive. This will give you greater levels of precision while performing these small inputs. It does, however, reduce the amount of precision when making larger inputs. However, a lot of time can be found in F122 for mastering your input smoothness. Increasing your linearity will help with this. It will dramatically reduce the twitchy feeling that you can get when racing with a controller. The saturation setting for your throttle, brake and steering will increase your overall sensitivity of your inputs. Increasing this setting will reduce how far you have to press the trigger or move your analog stick to achieve the same amount of input. This is incredibly useful if you are unable to register 100 on any of the button tests we did earlier on. For example, increasing your throttle saturation will allow you to hit 100% throttle input earlier in your trigger pull. Reducing it a lot could mean that you'll be hitting full throttle by only pulling the trigger around half of its normal distance. You won't want to mess with saturation too much. However, if you couldn't hit 100 on any of the button tests, you can increase the relevant saturation slightly. After each increase, retest your buttons and keep adjusting until you're happy you can hit 100 on the button test. That should be the point that you stop increasing saturation. The ideal controller settings that I'm using for F122 is mainly focused around adjusting the linearity for all inputs. I've started by increasing the steering dead zone ever so slightly. This eliminates any wandering when driving in a straight line at speed. Next, I've increased the steering linearity to 40. I've done this to give myself more precise control when applying fine controller inputs. You'll require a lot of precision in F122 when cornering, positioning your car and battling on track. Having extra precision over small detailed inputs certainly helps. Then I've also increased the throttle linearity and brake linearity. The throttle linearity has been increased to 50. This helps when exiting slow corners. It is very easy to break traction and spin your rear wheels in F122. Extra precision when applying throttle inputs is extremely helpful. I've set the brake linearity setting to 35. With the brake, we'll generally be applying a large amount of input to slow the car down. This makes the linearity of the brake trigger a little less important than the steering and throttle. However, having some extra precision as we start to reduce the amount of brake pressure helps us manage our trail braking. The force feedback settings in F122 affect controllers just like they do with a racing wheel. While a racing wheel will be able to have much more defined and realistic force feedback, it is still very useful when racing F122 with a controller. Changing the main force feedback strength setting to 150 will increase the overall strength of all controller vibrations. It will mean you have a lot more vibration in your controller at almost every point. This is great as you'll have more indications of when your car is losing grip and how the track feels. With the current generation of controllers, both the Xbox Elite Series 2 and the PS5 DualSense controller have vibration in the triggers. This is invaluable when it comes to racing F122 with a controller. Vibrations in the triggers will notify you when your car is losing grip. Your brake trigger will start to vibrate when you're about to lock a wheel, and your throttle trigger will tell you when you're about to break traction under acceleration. Increasing the overall force feedback strength will increase these sensations. I've set both the on-track effects and rumble strip effects to 100 to give us the most amount of feedback possible. I've set the off-track effects lower to 75 to make it a little easier to get back on track. However, these three settings are entirely down to personal preference. Play about with them until you're comfortable with how much your controller is vibrating. I'd recommend leaving the wheel damper setting to 50 as this doesn't directly affect controllers, and the same applies to understeer and enhance. The maximum wheel rotation is an interesting setting for controller gamers. When using a racing wheel, this setting changes how much you have to turn your steering wheel to reach the maximum lock. However, on a controller it behaves a little differently. We can actually decrease the maximum wheel rotation to around 280 to 290 to give us even greater levels of precision when steering with the analog stick. By reducing this setting, you'll be reducing how much you can actually turn the steering wheel. But by doing this, you'll gain extra precision while making steering inputs. Don't push this too far and lower it below around 280, otherwise you won't be able to turn around some tighter corners in F122. The final part of your controller settings to customize are your button bindings. Here you can change what each button on your controller does and what it controls in-game. This is especially useful if you're using a premium controller such as the Xbox Elite Series 2, as these controllers give you additional inputs such as triggers on the rear which can be used in F122. Many of the default button bindings in F122 are okay. You have your main controls such as activating DRS, the pit limiter and overtake mode already assigned to the best buttons for the job. If you're using a controller with additional buttons on the rear, like the Elite controller, I'd recommend using the rear buttons for your gear shifting. However, there are a few inputs that you should certainly change. These are the look left, look right inputs. By default they'll be set to be controlled by your right analog stick. However, you'll rarely use this feature while racing as you have pretty good vision from the in-game cameras. I'd highly recommend changing these four inputs to something that is used more often. I'd recommend setting them to control your brake bias and on-throttle differential. Both of these settings are used a lot during a race, with real-world Formula 1 drivers changing these settings multiple times a lap. This will give you very quick control over making fine car adjustments in between corners. To be able to change your buttons, simply head over to the controls vibration force feedback, settings, then select the racing wheel or controller that you wish to use, click edit mappings, scroll down the list to find the input you wish to change, click the input you wish to change and then press the button you want to change it to. Save and then leave this menu to finish button mapping. With these ideal controller settings, you should be able to drive with much better precision in F122, and you should feel like you have much more control over your car, as well as improving the ease of making car adjustments mid-race. As always, if you guys find this video helpful, drop it a like, and leave me a comment below, let me know what settings you use for your controller, and whether you have any questions. I do look at every comment I get, and I try my best to reply to as many as I can. If you want more content like this for F122, subscribe to our channel and hit that alert notification bell, as I'll be releasing a lot of F122 content over the coming days and weeks. But for now guys, I'll see you on track.